Welcome back. Now, President Ramaphosa's working visit to the U.S. is underway. And in a first since his presidency in January, by invitation, President Trump will host the African head of state tomorrow. The meeting comes at a time when bilateral relations between the two nations are strained as the countries have clashed over race politics and the Israel-Gaza war. And while there is no specific agenda set for the meeting, the big question is whether bilateral relations can be mended amidst it all. Bob Wekesa, acting director of the African Center for the Study of the U.S. at Wits University, joins us with his take. Bob, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Now, really a make or break moment for President Ramaphosa in his last term, meeting the president of the U.S., President Trump, where our relations, of course, need to be mended, and also him being the first African president to meet Trump. Let's talk about, what's at stake here, just your analysis of it all.
I think the core issue here is economic, even though the politics is the driver. At the base of everything is diplomatic relations between South Africa and the U.S. Mm-hmm. There have been major claims of white genocide leveled at South Africa from certain quarters in the U.S., including from President Trump himself. There's been issues around geopolitics, the idea that South Africa is more inclined towards the BRICS, China, Russia, India, that South Africa is a global South power that is trying to contest global North politics, particularly hurting the interest of the rich nations, U.S. included, particularly U.S. And so those are the political aspects coming through. But at the heart of it, I think President Cyril Ramaphosa must have reached out to his U.S. counterpart and other interlocutors in Washington, D.C. on economic matters, because the tariffs that have been directed towards South Africa is actually a hammering of South Africa. The fact that South Africa has been targeted is more consequential on the economic front, because I think South Africa's economy needs growth, needs jobs, needs manufacturing and all that. Yeah.
And on that trade front, what kind of conversations do you expect to take place, especially as AGOA hangs in the balance? Should we just forget about AGOA and, potentially start thinking of President Ramaphosa perhaps negotiating a trade deal of our own, an SA-US trade deal?
No, certainly. I think you are on point there, because first of all, this September is when AGOA renewal is due. It is very unlikely that AGOA will be renewed at all. So I think all African countries, South Africa included, have to start thinking of a more bilateral approach with the U.S. than a collective, preferential trade agreement. Because Trump, in his America First trade policy, does not want collectivity, doesn't want a grouping that is AU, African Union, or many African countries. He wants to negotiate in a transactional manner with each country for itself. Mm-hmm. So I think it is only fair to say South Africa can try to lobby other African countries to come together, but where will that end up at? Not much, because really the US is focused on getting this directly.
Let's turn our focus to the delegation that has joined President Cyril Ramaphosa. I can imagine the importance of having Minister of Agriculture John Steenhuisen part of that delegation, especially as a white man, as we have these race relations in the midst, and especially as a white man that is heading up the agricultural ministry and as the leader of the opposition party, right?
That taps into the point we made earlier, the accusation that the South African government, through the Land Expropriation Act, is targeting white farmers, particularly Afrikaner farmers. And so because the DA, led by John Steenhuisen, who is also Minister for Agriculture, kind of is the face of the white South Africa, if you wish, it is always good optics to have him in the delegation, because then he addresses issues of racism that come across. In fact, quite a good number of commentators believe that Trump has taken a racist stance. So having a white man and the top leader and a coalition partner, a GNU partner, is good in terms of then putting issues on the table. And of course, more substantively, that is the optics side of things. But more importantly, on the agriculture end of things, South Africa is a major agricultural exporter to the US.
Yes.
Wine, citrus fruits, and other agricultural products. And these are the same products that African farmers rely on in terms of incomes. So it is always good that his agriculture minister, who happens to be white, who happens to be in the coalition government, all that then helps to tick several boxes at once.
And, the G20 also something that's quite important. Do you think perhaps President Ramaphosa may touch on that in those talks, and we could possibly see a change of mind from President Trump and perhaps see a U.S. delegation attend the G20 conference in November?
This is very slippery territory right there. One, because the U.S. under Trump is not very keen on multilateralism. The U.S. wants to pursue things on a unilateral basis, in the sense that it is the U.S. can organize itself, can approach things globally on its own rather than through a grouping of 20 nations, including the African Union. But, so that's one. I'm not very optimistic that Trump will relent and visit South Africa at the G20, because his DNA is anti-working in groups. Rather, it's making America great again. I think it's still very important, the fact that the next host of the G20 next year, 2026, is the US. And therefore, the will have been passed on from President Cyril Ramaphosa to Trump. So definitely that will be up for discussion.
Yeah.
Optics, I think that will not be the most critical issue on the table at this point.
Bob, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thanks so much for sharing those insights. That was Bob Wekesa, Acting Director of the African Center for the Study of the U.S. at Wits University.